So, Elspeth, thank you so much for joining us here on the Eat the System podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, I read your book and I found it probably one of the most enlightening books that I've read for a good while. One of the things that really hit me, and I think we need to address this straight away, which is I like foraging, and I will say that I'm a forager. And I will say that maybe we'll talk later about the difference between foraging and gathering and other types of use of wild food. And it's something that seems like it's received wisdom, and I've heard it quite a lot. And I always considered at the back of my mind there was something missing, which is wild food, full of vitamins, great for a healthy gut biome, but there's a calorie deficiency. It can't make up a staple. What has been missing from that equation?
I would say nut trees. I also always heard, that we couldn't feed ourselves from wild foods. And I remember as a kid asking what indigenous people in North America had eaten, because that didn't make sense to me. I didn't understand, okay, but it seems like other cultures have done this. And people would say nuts and berries. And then I would go out in the woods and I would not see nuts and berries that looked like they could feed you. We had blackberries and blueberries and stuff. But when you don't know which nuts are edible, I didn't have any idea that acorns were edible. So that didn't occur to me as a food source. And also, at least in North America, our species diversity has really been decimated by clear cutting for agriculture. And so the nuts that we see in the woods now don't represent what the potential is and what has been there in the past. So when you tell kids, oh, it's not possible, or oh, nuts and berries, it's a very unsatisfying answer. And that was part of what was so exciting to me about learning that acorns are edible.
So I like to say I pretty much always knew acorns were edible. But me and my son used to do a lot of foraging together. We had a thing of things you should eat and things you could eat. So, for example, he knows you can eat ewes if you don't swallow the seed inside. And I was like, really, you shouldn't, please don't. But he loved them. But one of the ones is, my feeling was, if you have to process something so much that it's not poisonous, is it genuinely edible? So how do you match the idea that acorns are a staple with the fact that in their natural state, they're not actually edible?
Yeah, so acorns have the same chemical in them that olives have. It's called a tannin. So they're full of tannins, and tannins are a preservative. So if anyone listening has ever eaten an olive straight off the tree, they know that it's a terrible experience. It's super bitter, very astringent. You'll basically immediately spit it onto the ground. But obviously, the tannins in olives have not stopped us from processing that food and making it into a really important crop. And the same is true for acorns. So one really cool thing about tannins, even though they're a bit of a pain in the butt in terms of processing, is that they're actually, as a preservative, it means that acorns, once they've been picked up and dried, they can last for decades. So they're an amazing preservative in terms of, having food on hand that isn't going to spoil. And to get them out, you basically have to soak acorns in water. And there's a lot of different methods depending on the type of oak tree that you're gathering from, the culture, the place, but they are water soluble. So it's actually, it's not that big of a hurdle, and it's something that people in many places have figured out how to work through.
So one of the reasons I like my food simple, even when I process it, one of the concerns that I always had was, so the way that we are normally told that indigenous peoples process acorns is they basically get them in a net, throw them in the river, leave them till the tannins have washed out, and then bring them back again. And the idea of trying to recreate that in your kitchen with the jar seemed impossible. Is it possible to actually do that at home and it not be a pain in the backside?
It is. It's definitely taken me a bit of experimenting to figure out what setup works for me personally. And I will say, as much fun as it is to experiment on a personal level, and I'll talk a little bit about my setup, I do think that if we want to make anything a staple crop, we need to come up with regional, sort of economies of scale to make it work. That said, if people want to experiment at home, the system that I have sort of cobbled together from a variety of sources is when I gather acorns, I always first dry them. They come out of their shells much easier once they've been dried. So I have a lot of shallow baskets or baking sheets. You just spread them out. Usually they're falling around the time it's time to start the wood stove or the heat. So then the air in the house gets dry and they dry quite easily. You can also dry them outside in the sun, but you do have to keep them covered up because otherwise you have to have some kind of netting or wire. Otherwise the squirrels and turkeys and everyone else will say, "Oh, you've gotten me a snack." That's nice. So I let them dry for a few weeks. And then there's a hand crank machine or nutcracker, whatever you want to call it, called a Dave Built. Those are manufactured in Texas in the US by a family that's all about nuts. They crack lots of different nuts, but they're really great for acorns. Other people do it with a hammer or a rock. That is also fun. It is quite time consuming. I was just in Switzerland where they do a lot of chestnut processing, and they were putting dried chestnuts into these long, thin bags, sort of like this shape, and they were hitting them against a stump, and that cracks them open really effectively as well. So there's a few different ways to crack them open. The Dave Built I found to be sort of the most effective and efficient. And then you have to sort the nut meats from the shells, just like with any nut. So if you're collecting from some species of oaks, you can do what's called the float test. The shells will float and the nut meats will sink, and that makes it really easy to separate. So those are the trees that I tend to collect from. There are other trees where you have to sort it by hand. And again, I'm sort of dialing in that part of the processing. In Switzerland, where I was learning the chestnut processing, they had winnowing baskets, and I got to practice that. And that was a really effective way to separate the nut meats from the shells. So I think it's really helpful to look at cultures that still have some of this knowledge and what they were doing. So winnowing, you're tossing up and some of it's blowing away and getting sorted out. So once you've got the nut meats separated from the shells, I put the nut meats in a Vitamix with water, and you just pulse it a few times. That particular blender is very powerful. I recommend using a powerful blender, and it sort of turns into this slurry. And then I just take a big colander and I line it with a dishcloth, like a thin, almost cheesecloth type dishcloth. And I pour that slurry in, and I have a sink, like a laundry sink downstairs, that it's okay if it's just sort of in use for a while. Nobody gets annoyed. And I put the water on at a very bare trickle. Nothing where I feel badly like, oh, I'm just letting all this water go down the drain. It's a tiny bit of water. And that's just enough to let there always be a few inches above the acorn slurry of water. And it just filters the tannins out. And I go back the next day, and it's usually the tannins are all gone. And I just want to say also, that is quite a few steps, right? You're drying the nuts, you're cracking the nuts, you're sorting the nuts from the shells, you're pureeing the nuts, and then you're leaching the tannins out. And at the same time, I think that a lot of us would be really surprised if we were handed a field of wheat to harvest at how many steps are actually involved in getting from that wheat stalk to flour. So I think that's, it's an important reminder. Most of us just go to the store and pick up a bag of flour. And obviously that's much easier, and it would be much easier if we could do that with acorns. But right now that's not usually available.
And we do have evidence of countries where flour and other grain milling and staple milling is done at home, how much of the day is taken up by the household members that are carrying out those processes.
Quite a bit.
So in terms of, I think, scalability of these kind of what would be seen at the moment as alternative food streams is really important. Is it possible to scale this up? And I'm going to throw in another question there, which is the issue of, not the issue of, but the use of lye. Is that something that you think is appropriate to use when you're scaling up?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential with lye. There's a really interesting map that I found when I was researching acorn processing history in North America. And a man named Harold Driver in the 1950s had made this map of different indigenous groups in North America and the ways that they had traditionally processed acorns. Because, we talk about acorns like they're one thing, but there are hundreds, I think almost 600 or over 600 species of oaks in the Northern Hemisphere. So when I'm talking about an acorn and when you're talking about an acorn, we can be talking about things that act very differently. They have different tannin contents. The tannins come out easily or they're very hard to get out. And so people in different places had different processing techniques. Where I live in Eastern North America, it has traditionally been very common to use lye in processing acorns because we have some species where the tannins are very stubborn and very hard to get out. And that's the same process that's used with corn nixtamalization. If people are familiar with that, that's another traditional indigenous processing technique for corn to free up the B vitamins. It's also used in olives. So table olives, many of those are processed with lye. So lye sounds kind of scary and caustic, but it's actually very common in food processing. And it's a really fun experiment. So if you take a bunch of acorn nut meats and you put them in a big glass jar with water and you stir in a little spoonful of lye, the water instantly turns black. And that's because the tannins are getting pulled out with the lye. And if you rinse that a few times, then you have almost immediately gotten the tannins from the acorns. So yes, I do think that has potential. There are some people who say they feel like it changes the flavor a bit. I honestly haven't noticed that. And maybe it's one of those things like cilantro or something where some people are very sensitive to it and others are not. I don't notice a big change. So yeah, that's definitely one of the options in terms of scalability.
Yeah, and lye being not in the old days, I think it was processed wood ash.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, there's different ways to make it, but it's pretty fascinating how many people in different places have figured out how to make it from wood ash.
Yeah. So acorns, and it was a mast year this year. And
yes, here too.
Like I've really let the side down by not harvesting some and having a go at them. My excuse is I was really busy this year because normally I do like a project. I would have been really happy to get myself some acorn pancakes made. Are they the only? Well, I think you talked about chestnut trees and the loss of chestnuts. So in terms of the range of potential staple nuts, we've got acorns, obviously. What about the other types of nuts that we could be harvesting?
They're all, I think, really important. One of the things that is lost when we have these industrial monocultures is diversity. So, it would be just as terrible in some ways to have just a monoculture of oak trees. I mean, I still think it would be actually a lot better. We're not going for a monoculture, or at least I wouldn't design any food system as a monoculture. There's a lot of risk in that in addition to the biodiversity impacts. Here in North America, we've lost our native chestnut. It's functionally extinct. There are a lot of efforts to try to bring it and also hybrids of mixed species of chestnuts back. There's some really cool stuff happening in the Midwest here with farmers planting these hybrid chestnuts on their farms and having really great success. So I think chestnuts are really exciting as a growing crop and a growing market. People here tend to not be as familiar with them, I think, as people in Europe where the native tree hasn't been lost. There's also a huge history of hazelnuts as a staple food all over the Northern Hemisphere, a really important food crop and basketry crop. What's cool about a lot of these nut trees is they have more than one use. And oftentimes in taking care of them to produce food, you're also getting fibers, you're getting, tool handles. It's actually really fascinating the way that people have managed woodlands. And then I would also throw into the mix walnuts. We have a native black walnut here in North America. I know there's also English walnuts. So those are sort of the top four that stand out to me, but there's lots of other less common, in the South here, we have pecans. All over the Northeast, we have hickories. I don't know if hickories are common across the pond.
No, I think they're either imported as trees or we get them in sort of exotic, little small expensive packets of exotic nuts.
Yeah, so those are quite good as well. I think wherever people live, there's almost always oak trees, right? Because they're one of the most common nut trees. But I would encourage people to look around Look at a field guide, look at your local nature center or something like that and find out what the species are. Because often there are sort of these wild type species, and then there are also cultivars that have been bred specifically for food production. And those both have sort of advantages and disadvantages. And there's some really interesting literature about how traditionally most cultures have actually combined those two types of trees into their woodland management so that they have some trees specifically bred for, maybe really high production or really big nuts, and then still keeping wild genetics to hold on to that diversity in case of a blight or, whatever's going to come our way next, which is increasingly hard to predict.
Yes, absolutely. I think we're going to look even more about management and what we do now and what we do in the future. But I think in order to do that, I think we also need to dive into the past and think about this historically as well. And also, because what you've discovered or rediscovered as you're digging into the past also redefines what we see as ancient activities. I want to talk about gathering and foraging. I would say that I forage mainly because I just go out and see what I can find. And when I go on a walk, I go and see what I can find. The place that I, like during COVID, which is where I discovered that I loved foraging, we had a particular walk in a particular area of a couple of acres of cemetery, actually, but kind of very wooded cemetery. And something that I found didn't quite match up was the idea that you just went off and foraged, and the idea that you get to know the landscape, you get to know the trees. So, as we got into winter, I was like, now I've seen that this is a particular tree. I want to know what it looks like in winter, and I want to remember where it is. What is the difference between what we would do as modern detached foraging and actual gathering from a hunter-gathering society?
Yeah. So when I was researching the book, I spent some time in present-day Northern California with a man who I've gotten to know named Ron Reed. And he's a member of an indigenous tribe there, the Karuk people. He's also a cultural biologist, a medicine man, a really fascinating person. His culture has traditionally relied on acorns as a staple food since time immemorial. And a lot of cultures in that area have relied on acorns as a staple food for a really long time. And they've traditionally been cast as hunter-gatherers, right? And the sort of stereotype of the hunter-gatherers, they wake up in the morning and they sort of go out and look for what they're going to eat that day. And that it really couldn't be further from the truth. Almost all hunter-gatherer societies around the world, or all that I know of, and once we stop to think about it, that's really a pretty harmful narrative because it paints hunter-gatherers as people of the past and people who aren't thinking very carefully about their food supply. But the reality is that these landscapes have traditionally been carefully tended to produce these foods. It's not a relationship where someone's just wondering what they're going to find that day. For instance, so Ron's people have traditionally tended oak ecosystems with prescribed fire, as a way of taking care of these trees and ensuring that they produce an abundant crop year after year. So oak trees are actually, many species are fire adapted. So they have this thick bark. Their acorns sprout really well after a fire. Fires can help manage the water cycle on the land, keep down pests and pathogens. So really, all the same jobs that we do when we're talking about farming, you're preparing the land for your crop, you're managing water, you're managing pests and pathogens. A fire can act as a jumpstart by recycling nutrients back into the soil. So it's also like a fertilizer. So it's all these same jobs. It's just taking care of a crop that looks different from a lot of the ones that we're familiar with in terms of row crop farming. It's just a huge...
Yeah.
There's a huge stereotype.
The thing about fire I found fascinating, and I'm sure years and years ago, watching old nature documentaries, and it seemed that the problem with fires and wildfires isn't the fire, it's the fact that we basically do our very best to accidentally build up as much tinder and as much fuel as possible, and then act really surprised that when it catches, it goes out of control. Is there a role for fire in
Yeah.
modern agriculture or modern land management?
Yeah, I think there's a really important role, and one that ecologists and people in the farming community and fire practitioners are really just starting to fully understand. This is something that, especially in the west of the US, indigenous cultures have been saying for a long time, and that I think Western culture really didn't understand. So, if you take something like an oak ecosystem, right? Oaks are fire adapted, and actually, most fire adapted species have very flammable leaf litter because they want to kind of encourage, that it's okay with them if things burn, and that's fine. And when that builds up year after year, what you create is a highly flammable ecosystem that hasn't been burned, where you're going to get a catastrophic wildfire because you haven't been managing the fuels. And we often talk about fire as this really dangerous and sort of catastrophic thing. But one thing that really struck me when I was researching the book and that just stopped me in my tracks was that if you look at the equation for photosynthesis, the molecules that have to come together in as the plants are creating sugars and carbon, the reverse equation for that is combustion. The role of fire anywhere in the world that you have plant life, you will always have fire. Fire is a recycler of plant life. It is, fire takes apart what the plants are putting together. It will happen through lightning strikes. It will happen naturally. However, historically, all over the world, since we humans learned how to manage fire, which there's a bit of debate about when exactly that was, but a very long time ago, we have been actually the main fire managers in most ecosystems. And it's a role that a lot of us have forgotten, and a role that I had never heard anything about when I started writing this book. And the more I learned about different oak ecosystems, the more I realized that this relationship between humans and these nut trees and fire really has spanned many, many areas of the world for thousands of years and is really ancient, and one that there are so many benefits if we can get back to it.
I'm going to talk a little bit more about land management. It's just something I get a bee in my bonnet about, the idea of land management. But I'm just going to say that, so occasionally I teach geography. I teach as well. It's half term at the moment, so we're on holiday, school holidays. But I do get to teach geography. And the impression that you always get from hunter-gatherers is that the hunters went off and got all the food, and the gatherers went off and got dessert and maybe a side salad. And it's really so far from that. They are both equal in producing the really important, the calories and the proteins and the starches that make up the bulk of our calorie intake, aren't they? But talking about land management and farming, I do feel like in this country as well, we've lost some of our ideas of land management or what land management should be. And I've always found it fascinating that the word farming, me historically, again, not having to, but loving teaching history, the idea that of tax farmers, and this actually being an ancient word, this isn't something that we've adopted to describe the activities of what were tax agents in the old model, which is you had a geographical area, you extracted the money from the wealth, portion of the wealth from the population. You got to keep some of it and you got to hand the rest of it to either the Lord or the King. I assumed that maybe there was some kind of coincidence between agricultural farming and tax farming. Having read your book, this doesn't seem to be the case. Tell me about how management of the land became the activity of farming.
Yeah, it's a confusing history a bit, but in so many places in Europe, the former land management model involved all of the land sort of being owned technically by the king or by God, but really managed by lords and managed. But then, the everyday practice was that the land was held in common. So yes, it technically belonged to the Lord via the king, via God, but actually there were huge areas of space, and particularly woodlands and pasture and cropland, that were managed collectively. So you might have rights to use a piece of land in a specific way, but you didn't own the land. You could have the right to collect firewood. You might have the rights of pannage, which was to turn out your animals, specifically pigs, in the autumn to fatten up on the nut harvest, rights to collect nuts and berries, all these different, really hunting and gathering rights on the land. And then what started to happen was these changes in land tenure. So it started happening after the Black Death. Suddenly there were these people had disappeared because the density of the population went down so much following that. So you had sort of this shift in power dynamics where lords were sort of desperate for people to work their land. And at first that was working really well for the peasantry, right? They were like, ooh, we have some more power than we had before. And they could rent out a piece of land that had maybe formerly been common land. And they could rent it out. The language is a little confusing, but sort of at farm was the term. So they could farm it out. And what they were doing with it was basically privatizing this formerly public land. As laws started to change to allow that more and more. And over time, over a period from about the 1400s to early 1900s, almost all the common lands became privatized and enclosed. And that happened in tandem with these changes in our financial system, where we didn't used to be able to legally charge interest on a loan. That was considered this awful moral sin, like as bad as murdering someone, right? Which is just amazing to read about, thinking about our global economy where it's the basis of everything. Everything that we're doing today used to be considered like murder, really bad, awful, you're going to hell for sure. And then that slowly became legalized. And as it did, these land use practices and the financial system and land tenure practices all started changing in tandem. This charging interest on a loan started creating these situations where we had to make the land increasingly more and more profitable just to be able to pay back what you owed, just to be able to stay competitive in this marketplace. And there's a really fascinating parable where this financial author who I was following actually plays it out. And he gives the example of chickens. He says, when you start with this financial system, everybody's just growing chickens or raising chickens to feed themselves, maybe to have some feathers, the basics. But if you're always getting a loan at interest, then you always have to produce more chickens just to pay back the loan. So as that goes on, there's just suddenly chickens everywhere. We're producing chickens. We're coming up with new uses for chickens. We don't even know why we want all these chickens. We can't even deal with them. And we're ruining the ecological health of the land. And I remember reading that parable and looking at grain farming in the US. And one thing that's really interesting is that we talk about grain farming, at least the way we do it, these industrial monocultures, as necessary to feed the world. That's a big story, at least here in the US. But when you look at it, we actually only eat about 1% of this grain. The rest is turned into ethanol. It's exported to other countries. And that actually is very bad for their own agricultural production. It's not feeding them in ways that are helpful. And then it's fed to animals that would do better on this other diet. That exact parable of the chickens is really playing out. We're just growing more and more grain and ruining more and more land. And it's not to feed ourselves. It's to feed this financial system and this system of land ownership. So if we can figure out how to stop, that would be really great.
Yes, it is. It feels like the idea of as farming being value extraction. And then it puts a different framing on the current agricultural system. Now, we spoke about Native Americans and their relationship with nuts. This was something that was apparently, from your historical research, incredibly common, a real unknown, and to me actually showed the interesting thing about history, how some things can be completely lost from historical memory or nearly lost. And it's the rural and small town relatively poor people, their use of chestnuts as income. Just tell us something about that, because I think it's completely amazing.
Yeah, so I was lucky to spend some time in Appalachia when I was researching the book. And there are a lot of communities in rural areas of Appalachia that actually relied on chestnuts as a form of currency until the chestnut blight, which happened in different communities at different times, but right around the time of the Great Depression. And many people who I spoke to said, oh, yeah, it wasn't the big financial collapse that really devastated our community because people there didn't have money in the stock market. That was not what was going on. But when the trees died at the same time, they lost their subsistence economy. So they had a system where people could go out and gather chestnuts. And there are descriptions of chestnuts just carpeting the woods inches deep. And they would go out and collect chestnuts and bring them to these small general stores. And these general stores had their own form of currency called due bills. So a due bill was just basically an IOU. If you brought in 100 pounds of chestnuts, maybe you were owed $5 or whatever it is. And what's really interesting is there was no interest on that, actually. So it was kind of outside of this greater currency system. And so there wasn't that same pressure to constantly increase production, which I was really fascinated by when I first started learning this. And then the stores would take the chestnuts and ship them out to the cities and sell them to the bigger markets. And there were these ledgers that a historian who I got to know had found that indicated that some people were making enough to make half of their store purchases for the year just from picking up nuts in the fall. So they would buy all their shoes. Obviously, the store wasn't meeting all their needs in the way that it does today because so many people were producing so much of their own food. But in terms of outside goods that they had to purchase, these nuts and chestnuts as a currency were meeting almost half of their annual needs. It was just incredible and really, really sad to hear the stories of devastation that occurred in the 1930s when the trees started dying from the blight and this currency was just completely lost.
I'm fascinated that it's only 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Around 100 years ago. And yet it's not a kind of common knowledge or part of our communal history or our communal story.
Yeah.
It just shows how something that is so integral and so part of our culture and our food culture can just disappear and we can lose complete sight of it. You spoke about going to Switzerland, and I know you've been to the UK as well. So for us on this side of the pond, are there any food traditions or nut traditions that we have equally lost?
Well, I feel like you've held on to more, but there was a time period in a lot of mountainous communities in Europe in particular, where during the so-called, sort of dark ages, which the more I learn about them, the more I'm wondering, were they actually just like relaxing ages? I'm not sure. I don't know. That's probably not true. But there was a big swing toward chestnut production in a lot of European communities after the fall of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire demanded taxes in grains. They had all these systems that sort of grain farming front and center. But one of the historians I spoke with was a really interesting guy, Paolo Squatriti, and he had done a lot of research on what happened after the fall. Because grain farming is very labor intensive, and especially wheat farming. Wheat used to be sort of this luxury grain because it's kind of picky and hard to grow in a lot of places, and really only flourished with slave labor during the Roman Empire. That was sort of the key to actually producing all this wheat. And once that whole empire and system fell apart, a lot of the peasantry sort of looked at their options and decided that instead of doing this incredibly labor-intensive grain farming, they were going to grow their main staple starch on chestnut trees, and that was sort of the best option. And in some of these communities, they were eating 330 pounds of chestnuts per person per year. And I got so stuck on that statistic because I started looking up, okay, what does the average American eat for grains per year today? 150 pounds of grains per year. So the chestnut consumption, while I think a lot of people in Europe today, still know that we can eat chestnuts and still have some chestnut traditions, I think people have really forgotten how common of a food this used to be. I mean, maybe almost a pound every day of chestnuts were consumed for a long time in a lot of places in Europe. And I just think that's fascinating.
Yeah, we eat one small packet once a year. We have a
Yeah, that's
local,
a little different.
yeah, we have a local huge fair that is like in our neighbourhood, but like one of the Europe's largest fairs. And one of the things my wife loves to do is go and get roast chestnuts. And I do remember when I was younger, there would be one or two people selling roast chestnuts in the autumn in the
Yeah.
city centre, and that is it really.
Yeah. Well, and hazelnuts too, actually. There was this time period in the UK in particular, British Isles, where the historians are calling it the nut age because when they look at the pollen records, there were just hazelnuts basically completely covering, I think it was, I might misquote it, but I think it was around 70 or 75% of the pollen during this time period, maybe between 5 and 7,000 years ago, was all hazelnut. So there's also that is much longer ago than 100 years, but also, a very long history with hazelnuts, which I think, are still more common, much more common in Europe than they are in North America as a food source.
Yeah, we've got one of the places where I go collecting my wild garlic as it happens. My ransoms is called nutwood for the very reason that the majority of it is just hazelnuts and it does appear to be managed. And occasionally as I go on my wandering, you will find pollarded areas or copses where you go into some area of a wood and then suddenly every branches, they're probably bigger than they should be, but they are just lots of stumps with small branches coming off because at some point in the past they'd been copsed and now are completely forgotten. In terms of bringing all of this not quite lost knowledge, well, we maybe lost the expertise to some degree, but we haven't, and we can regain that. And thankfully, thanks to you and some of the historians, we haven't lost the knowledge. Can we bring this system up to date into the modern age? Can we scale the farming? So, for example, what are the yields of nut trees compared to the common grains that we grow now?
Yeah, that was something that I was really interested in while I was researching because I kept thinking, okay, it's great that, these nut-based systems are really a game changer for biodiversity and for our ecosystem health, but can they really feed, last time they were feeding people, there weren't nearly as many humans. So what about today? Are they going to produce enough? And I had sort of a eye-opening conversation with an agronomist named Ricardo Salvador, who said basically, you want to talk about yield? Well, first, let's remember what yield is, right? Yield is a ratio and it has, a numerator and a denominator, and it's measuring what you're getting out for what you're putting in. And normally we are only talking, if we are talking about, the yield per acre for corn, right? We're only measuring the land where that corn is growing. We're not measuring all the land that's used to create the inputs that are sort of then staged on this like falsely productive area, right? We're not measuring the land that we needed to produce the seed, the fertilizer, the pesticides, the machinery to mine the fuels, all the land that's ruined in the transport of all those goods. So we're just talking about one number. And when you actually look at both numbers, anytime you're comparing sort of a monoculture of a field crop to a diverse system with many species and some woodland area mixed in, that is always more productive, that wooded area. First of all, from a photosynthesis level, you cannot produce the same amount of photosynthetic action on this short little stubby field of one type of grain as you can from this really tall system involving trees. It's basic ecosystem math. And so I think that when we talk about these yields, we really need to look at both numbers because land is the limiting factor for producing enough food for people in the world. And so we have to accurately count all the land that we're using to produce food, not just the harvest acres, right? But actually all the production acres. And when we do that, these diverse polyculture systems centered around nut trees are always more productive.
And I also, to some degree, wonder if some of the land that we would call marginal land under a monoculture would turn out to be not quite so marginal or maybe not marginal at all once the ecosystem that the land belonged to or the is brought back into play.
Yeah, I think that we're kind of looking at it backwards. We're trying to limit the amount of land that we're producing food on because we are doing such a rotten job for the ecosystems producing food. We're ruining ecosystems with our food production. I think what would be a more interesting way to look at it is how can we enhance ecosystem health while we produce food and then not feel like we have to limit it in that way because we are actually making these ecosystems thrive for an abundance of species, including ourselves, but also including a lot of wildlife species. And a lot of indigenous food production systems have done that and continue to do that. And it's really, I think, important that we shift our mindset to thinking that we have to ruin land in order to produce food because we don't.
So is it possible then that there is the extract value from the land to the point where at some point you have to move on or grow food in a factory or something, and then there's sustainable, which has an implication of keeping the system that we've got going ideally for as long as possible. Maybe if we work really hard we can live with it forever, or maybe we can just arrest the slow decline of the soil structures. And then there's regenerative farming, where it's a genuine attempt to climb back up that path that we've been going down. Is nut tree production, is that sustainable or is it regenerative?
It's very regenerative. So one of the really interesting things that got me into this research in the first place is I started learning about some of the ecological benefits of these nut trees on the land. I've always been, I was a kid who just was like, what are we doing? We're all going to die. This is not a good plan. How can we change this? And my parents were bird watchers, and they always were taking us around, showing us how different species were really perfectly adapted to their habitats. And so my mom got interested right around the time that I started getting interested in these oak trees in this bird guy and entomologist, so insect and bird guy named Doug Tallamy. And he was doing a lot of research on how insects and plants rely on each other. And he had found that some plants are really the heavy lifters in terms of supporting bird life and, so on up the food chain, because it starts with these insects that the birds are eating, and then it's moving up into the larger creatures. And he found that oaks are the top life support species in almost every ecosystem where they occur. So he was looking at, maples and all these other species. So maples as a genus support maybe like 300 types of insects. Oaks, it's more than almost 600, I believe. So just this incredible amount of life support in our ecosystems. And every nut tree that I was looking at for North America was in the top 20 of those top life support species. So on a biodiversity level, they have huge potential to restore some of the insect decline we're seeing, some of this extinction crisis. And then in terms of carbon and nutrient cycling, we talk a lot about the carbon cycle, but we're also seeing huge issues with the nitrogen cycle, all these other elements. They are regulating in ways that these annual plants cannot. So when we plant annual crops and then we plow them up after harvest year after year, every time we disturb that soil, we're re-releasing all of the carbon that those plants put into their roots back into the atmosphere. It's like reopening a wound year after year after year. When we grow food with these perennial crops, we are actually allowing them to put more carbon into the ground every single year. And so that alone has this huge implication. And then when you add in this layer of potential fire management, all fires create kind of, two byproducts, ash and this black charred matter, right? We've all seen it in the bottom of a wood stove or something. And actually that's a form of carbon that doesn't biodegrade in sort of human timescales. It's on the thousands of year timescale. And so that is this other element in terms of land management that I think that we don't fully understand all of the ways that could be used yet. But yes, there's just huge potential to not just reverse and sort of limp along, but to actually really bring life back into a lot of our landscapes.
Yeah, again, that the biochar, as we call it, is when it's a separate production when we bring it in. And there was a guy at an open day a couple of years ago that was producing biochar. Very nicely, I asked very nicely if he would let me have a bag full, which probably saved me about $30 of buying it from a farmer's market. It was again something that the knowledge of bringing black carbon or carbon into the soil in that way is something that was discovered, something that was done thousands of years ago, and was ironically also discovered, a few hundred years, 500 years ago, Europeans discovered that there was this amazing rich soil, and it never seemed to occur to us that we should get in on the game of that kind of farming, which I find completely ridiculous. But it's good that it's being brought back in again. In terms of things like mixed farming, so one of the models of regenerative farming is that it can be mixed, that you can have within your different types of production. So your grains and your animal production or dairy can be brought together. Is there a possibility of creating a farming system with nut trees that can bring in a wider range of agricultural goods?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me that's the most hopeful model. I think we always want to have a mosaic of landscapes, right? I talk a lot in the book about ecological succession, which is that process where you go from a bare dirt, sort of disturbed land, all the way to whatever is a mature ecosystem in your part of the world. Where I am, that's a closed canopy forest, so very shady forest. And if you have all one or all the other, then you're going to be missing out on a lot of opportunities for diversity. And so what I see as sort of the most promising is some large areas of these sort of oak savanna type ecosystems where there's big open grown nut trees, probably with animals grazing underneath, and also some areas of row crop farming, because there are some species that really thrive in a not monoculture, but mixed species row crop system. And that is when we look around the world at most traditional food production systems, what we see is a mix. And so it's this diversity of different stages of succession on the landscape. The row crop farming is focused on these primary succession species, right? These early colonizers of bare areas, and those are important for their own reasons. And then these oak woodlands are sort of like a middle stage. And then we're going to want some areas, you're not going to have maple syrup production unless you have these shady closed canopy forests. They all have a role to play. And most cultures have managed to have patches of a variety of stages on the landscape. And I think what's happened, I had someone say, oh, so you never want to farm grains again. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying what we've decided to do now is really only focus on these earliest stages of succession and these plants that need bare earth. And even if we just converted, maybe 50% of our farming to this later stage of succession where we can have trees and pasture and animals kind of mixed together, that alone could just have a huge impact on our landscapes. And I think it's all about managing for a mosaic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the idea of mixed, complex, regenerative farming is sometimes people might say, well, it's really difficult to do and it's too complex. But monoculture requires GPS. It requires computers, it requires chemicals, and most farmers need to hire in agronomists to maximize their yield. So it doesn't seem any more complicated than that to me. Shall we move on to food and the end result of all of this? Before we get into the culinary aspects, I just want to get into the nutritional aspects. I was always taught that nuts are protein. Now, looking at reading the actual nutrition, I blame myself for not doing my own research and just relying on classroom textbooks. When I read the nutritional profiles that are in your book, it's nothing like as straightforward as that. What is the nutritional profile of nuts?
It depends. It depends which nut you have. So something like a chestnut is almost all starch. And you can actually learn a lot about the nutritional properties of a nut from looking at the ways that they've been traditionally processed. Chestnuts are always dried because if you don't dry a carbohydrate right away, it molds and spoils. So they're almost all starch, all carbohydrates. And then when you look at something like an acorn, it depends on the species of oak tree. Some acorns have a lot more starch. There was a study of some prehistoric remains that were found of this culture that ate basically only these super sweet, super starchy acorns, and their teeth apparently looked like someone who had just eaten candy for their entire life. They were all rotted out. It was a total disaster because that was all they ate, was these super starchy acorns. So I don't recommend that. But some acorns are a real mix of proteins, fats, and starches. You can actually tell a lot about an acorn when you crack it open. The more it's colored like a peanut, I would say, the more starch it has. And the more orangish it is, reddish orangish, the more oil it has. So the acorns with a higher fat content, some can actually be pressed for oil the way we press for olive oil. So you can actually tell a lot visually from looking at an acorn, cracking it open. And then when it comes to nuts like walnuts and hazelnuts, those are primarily fat, a good amount of protein, and just a little bit of carbohydrates. And those are the nuts that, acorns were able to store because they have those tannins, right? So even though they're very starchy, they have a preservative. But the walnuts, the hazelnuts, once those are dried, they store for a very long time in their shells. And that's because of those fats. Fats help food store. It's the same reason you can store olive oil at room temperature for a long time. The sort of storage and the way you handle it when you're harvesting and processing actually tells you a lot about it.
So that means we've got oils, we've got starches, we've got proteins. What kind of culinary uses are we looking at then from nuts?
Yeah, so the most common are flours, starch, similar to like a cornstarch. Acorn starch works just like cornstarch. I've made it, I've used a lot of it. It's very common in Korean cooking. So flour, starch, oils, and then a lot of cultures have also made nut milks. Sometimes nuts can be, for instance, black walnuts or hickory nuts in northeastern US. They can be hard to process, and so sometimes they're actually just cracked and then boiled to create a nut milk.
I'm just going to have a little rant now about nut milks, which is that nuts, we've got a thing in Europe where large dairy concerns are and have to a largely successfully outlawed the use of the word milk when it comes to nuts. I can't find the historical sources that I got before, but there are some historical sources, some well-regarded books on the history of food that say that almond milk was a much more common milk than cow's milk in the Middle Ages because it preserved, it didn't go off. Butters and cheeses were common, but actual milk. And the reason why dairy milk is called dairy milk is to distinguish it from the nut milks that were at least equally common.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Because if you think about it, to produce almond milk, you just get some almonds and you produce milk. The almonds will store for as long as almonds will store, and then you create the milk. You've got if you're lucky, 2 or 3 days if you've got good storage facilities before milk goes off. So milk was very rarely drunk unless it was processed.
Yeah, I would think that yogurt and cheese and butter would be much more common. I've dealt with raw milk and it's a pain. It's always going bad.
And even butter would be so heavily. The reason why we have salt in butter is it was so heavily salted, you'd have to wash the salt out before you could use it. And then so you'd rinse it out and then and obviously the fats would stay and the salts would dissolve. And then you could use the butter. So anyway, enough ranting about the fact that nut milk is one of the original milks, and we stand by that, even if it would be literally illegal for me to produce almond milk and call it that. So shall we share a couple of recipes then? What's your favourite nut recipe then?
Probably my favorite right now that I've been making is I use either an acorn flour or chestnut flour base, and then I add a lot of nuts and seeds, and I've been making these crackers. And I find that they're really easy sort of beginner recipe, a good entry point for people beginning to experiment, and very tasty. I just roll them out. I make a sort of wet dough and then roll it out between two pieces of parchment paper and sprinkle it with flaky sea salt. And they're always a crowd pleaser and they disappear quite quickly. And I have two kids, so crackers are in high demand. And it's a good way to sort of, I think a lot of people with nuts start with dessert, and that's all well and good. And there are lots of amazing nut dessert recipes, but desserts are not a staple food. And so I've been trying to move away from the dessert category when I'm introducing people to these nuts that they maybe haven't eaten before, like acorns or chestnuts.
I think I need to go and buy some acorn flour. I need to bite the bullet, get on eBay, see if there's some culinary provision store online that can supply me with some acorns, and then maybe I'll actually I know it won't be a master year next year, so I will do my very best. But their acorns are plenty anyway, aren't there? I'm going to go and try some processing. A very traditional, and probably the last way of using traditional or having a traditional dish is a Christmas dish, which is where a lot of traditional foods still survive in the UK. Things that would be eaten all winter are now eaten for a week. And that's putting Brussels sprouts with chestnuts, boiling them together or roasting them in the oven with a bit of butter is a really good one. But
that sounds good.
It's really good. So I can't recommend that highly enough. But at the moment, thanks to your book and the fact that there's a discount store for people that work for charities and emergency services and various places. I got some nut puree, like vast amounts of nut puree. I think I've got another 24 of these somewhere. And it was your recipe for chestnuts with porcini mushrooms.
I love combining chestnuts and mushrooms. There's so many good chestnut mushroom soups. There's one recipe that I made where you just sort of saute chestnuts and mushrooms together and you add a bit of cream. And I was really surprised by how good that was. And it's cool because they grow together, right? So these trees and these mushrooms are having this relationship. And so it kind of makes sense that they would be so good together on the table. I was just, when I was just in Switzerland during the chestnut harvest, this area where I've been traveling to, the Bergell Valley, they've relied on chestnuts for thousands of years, since Roman times. And they've really got their chestnut cuisine totally dialed in. So they make chestnut flour, they make gnocchi, chestnut pasta. They have a castana miso, which was like a chestnut tiramisu because they call the chestnuts castagna. And they had these chestnut purees that were part of like a ravioli cream dish. And then many meats were served with a side of like sauteed cabbage or vegetables and roasted chestnuts. So it's very common to see them on the menu. They're almost everywhere. Really good.
I think that one of my other purchases, if I can't find one in the shops, is going to be some dried chestnuts as well. Because the beautiful thing about that, you're right, they sit on your provisions shelf and you just get them out and use them as you wish. They're not tinned, they're not processed, they're just there and ready to go. Well, I think this has been absolutely fascinating, and it feels like lots and lots of things fell into place when I read your book, and I think it's a really significant piece of work that needs to be not only more widely shared, but also there's a point now where people need to start doing something about it. So thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.